first armed guerrilla movement for national liberation in the Philippines back in 1898. And so by the current proponents who are basically taking up arms for national liberation against imperialism, I'm talking about the New People's Army, which is the military wing of the Communist Party of the Philippines, and their political wing, the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. These three entities are waging an underground revolutionary movement in the Philippines for national democracy. They're the leaders of the National Democratic Revolution in the Philippines. And organizations like mine, Bayan, our work is not, we do not ourselves take up arms. We are conducting our work on the streets and in the parliament. But we see our work as very complementary to the underground revolutionary movement. We aspire for the same ideals for the Philippines. We both want a Philippines that's free from foreign domination, we want genuine agrarian reform. The NPA is waging an agrarian revolution in the country to democratize it, and we want a government that is free of landlords, of U.S. puppets. So, and we want an end to fascism in our country. So, oh, sorry. So, yeah, second slide, please. When I say national democratic, like Fernando was saying, I want to be clear to you all that our movement is a national democratic movement of the new type. Because there is a national democratic movement of the old type. Back in 1898, Andres Bonifacio, who founded the Katipunan, was struggling for national liberation, but there was no vision of how that movement would be led. So the national democratic movement of the new type is led by the Philippine proletariat, and has a socialist perspective, meaning to say that once we are able to dismantle and seize political power and democratize the country and nationalize our resources, we will start a socialist revolution in the country. So, no, this slide. So this is the Philippines. It's an archipelago in the Pacific. How many of you have been to the Philippines by show of hands? Awesome. How many people here know Filipino people by show of hands? Awesome. Okay. So the Philippines is an archipelago of 7,107 islands. And amongst those islands, there are three main island groups: Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. Luzon is in the very top. That's also where the seat of political power is, where Manila is. The Visayas are a cluster of islands in the middle. And Mindanao is in the south. Mindanao has been in the news a lot lately, too. If you look at it geographically in relationship to Southeast Asia and the region, you can make a really big claim, such as the U.S. government has basically seen it as the gateway to Asia. It's a gateway to China. It's a gateway to Indonesia. It's a gateway to that whole region. And there are a lot of major trade routes that the Philippines is around. So one of those major trade routes is the Malacca Strait. And if you're familiar with trade, so many consumer goods, when they're being exported and imported, have to go through that strait to get from Asia to this side of the hemisphere, to this side of the continent. So control of that region is very, very important for U.S. imperialist interest. The Asia-Pacific region has the largest export market in the world. In fact, 1 trillion of the U.S. economy, 1 trillion's worth of the U.S. economy is tied to its export position in Asia. And by export position, I mean export of raw materials and export of human labor. Okay, so next slide. And so it says here, so our country is rich. It's rich, so you can do the second slide. It's rich in oil, it's rich in gold, it's rich in copper, it's rich in nickel, it's rich in natural gas, it's rich in bauxite. Bauxite is in everything. It's rich in fruits and vegetables, tropical fruits and vegetables. It's rich in timber, it's rich in mahogany. Next slide. But, yeah, so next slide. But the people there are poor. So if you were to go to the Philippines, this is a very much a common, you will, when you're on the plane going down to Manila, you will see a lot of nice, fancy condominiums. But if you look like right around the corner, you'll see a lot of, slums as well. So they're just around the corner. So basically, these big high-rises are basically just masking what are essentially slums. So next slide. So the situation of Filipino women is the situation of the Philippines. Next slide. The social liberation of Filipino women is integral to the Philippine national liberation. So on this note, I want to say that the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines very much upholds the emancipation of women as part of its program. But we did come to a period of time where we were confronted with what we view now as a bourgeois feminist movement that came into our movement, wherein the proponents of the bourgeois feminist line in the Philippines basically espoused that the liberation of Filipino women was separate and a parallel movement to the national liberation movement. So we have since gone through a rectification of that viewpoint, wherein we have been able to assert that the liberation of Filipino women is part and parcel of the Philippine national liberation movement and not a separate and parallel movement. Next slide. So in our view, our political line views the Philippines as a semi-feudal, semi-colonial country. And by semi-feudal, I basically mean that it's that the basic mode of production in the Philippines is still agricultural. It's tied to the land, but the practice of agriculture in the Philippines is very, very backwards. If you're familiar with, when you think of feudalism, some people think of, the medieval times in Europe with, serfs and lords, and it's kind of like that actually, to be perfectly honest. But you have landlords. You don't have kings, but you have kings and queens, but you have landlords, and you don't have serfs. You have, farm workers and peasants that basically live off the land, but don't reap any gains from their labor off the land. And also, we have a very backward, we don't have any modern agricultural implements in the country. We basically still rely on animals to till the land, and we're not, in this day and age, if you see here in the United States, we have big tractors, we have technology that has basically advanced, agricultural work. We don't have that in the Philippines. We're still reliant on, on water buffaloes to pull the plow through the field, and so we don't have an advanced agricultural practice in terms of technology. And by semi-feudal, I also mean that that the people that till the land don't own it. The people that till the land can't own it because they're not of the landlord class. So, and the landlord class in the Philippines, unfortunately, is a very fascist class. They are in power because they have private armies that basically inflict fascism against the poor of the population, particularly those from the rural communities. And this landlord class basically caters to the interests of U.S. imperialism. So, I guess, keep going. We have no major industries in the Philippines. You can basically live in the Philippines and from womb to tomb never buy or wear or consume anything that was totally manufactured from the country. We don't make anything. We only assemble things together. We assemble materials we put them together. We have a big assembly industry, but we don't make anything off of the wealth that we have come from our own soil. That's all pretty much controlled by imperialist corporate forces. Next. That's why because we don't have any major industries, we don't have a major domestic worker population. Our workers are our population is predominantly in the countryside, predominantly working off the land, and even our exports, our major exports, our raw materials, everything is made for export in the Philippines. Even education, higher education is conditioning you to be exported. So when I say export-oriented, import-dependent economy, it basically means we export cheap, super cheap, dirt cheap raw materials and cheap skilled labor, and we export. We import expensive, finished goods. In that type of economy, it leaves you with a chronic debt, in chronic crisis. Kind of like the crisis here in the first world, but chronic, meaning we don't go through a boom and bust. We just 24/7 bust, basically, yeah, and it just gets worse. So. And of course, I want to say in terms of the labor export policy in the Philippines, it's actually a model for countries that basically where there are a lot of sending countries that send workers abroad to remit back. The Philippines has basically developed the model for that in the world. It's called the labor export policy, wherein the government basically oversees and supervises the export of their own people to the world. And it's a very exploitative but very lucrative industry. Basically, the Philippine migrants, without their remittances, the Philippine economy wouldn't survive. I believe the statistics we have like an annual remittances that come up to $20 billion a year, and that's important to keep the Philippine economy afloat. In other words, the government has basically found a way to service their debts with the IMF and World Bank, mainly with the remittances of migrants, versus developing national industries, advancing the agricultural practice in the countries that it could survive on its own without having to send workers out. And 60% of all Filipinos that leave the country are women. 70, I'm being told 70% are women. And these are amongst the most vulnerable migrants because they are women. They are subjected to types of violations that don't on a mainstream level, that men migrants don't have to basically be subjected to. And I'm talking about cases of rape, cases of molestation, sex trafficking. Of course, I'm not saying that men don't encounter these things, but I'm just saying that women are particularly vulnerable to this. And the proponents of this labor export policy think nothing about protecting their own nationals when they're overseas. They basically abandon them. They leave them on their own to figure out what to do when they come across trouble. So, but they don't stop the sending of Philippine labor, particularly Filipino labor, because it's so important to the Philippine economy. Okay. So, what is the root of the Filipino people suffering? In our perspective, there's three basic problems to the Filipino people, to the Philippine society right now, and the root of suffering, and that is. Imperialism is the first main problem right now for the Filipino people. And by imperialism, I mean first we were a direct colony for many years, and then we were a commonwealth, which is like the same thing. And then we were given nominal independence in 1946, on July 4th, 1946. And I say nominal because it's not real independence. Even up till now, our economic, political, and social and cultural affairs are heavily influenced by the interest of U.S. imperialism or foreign dominated. Next. U.S. imperialism, I think it's important to note that, so the first picture there is a picture from the Philippine-American War. The Philippine-American War, in our view, is what is the blueprint of all U.S. imperialist wars of aggression. So many of the methods of combat, methods of torture, methods of psy-war, methods of counterinsurgency that the U.S. government currently employs were first tested back in 1898 during the Philippine-American War. So it was the first Vietnam, it was the first Iraq, it was the first time they perfected the waterboarding, was during the Philippine-American War. So I know it was in the 1800s, but I think it's important for us to always raise this and remind everyone that this was a real bloody war that Americans were up in arms against while it was happening. And there was a very vibrant anti-imperialist league in the United States during this time that was basically vocally critical about what was happening in the Philippines and all over the world. And one of the main speakers of this league was Samuel Clemens, or Mark Twain. He wrote extensively about his criticisms of the Philippine-American War. Next. Feudalism, I spoke about feudalism earlier. The woman on the top is Corazon Aquino. She is the widow, or she's also passed herself, but she was the widow of the late Philippine Senator Benigno Aquino Jr., and the mother of the current president of the Philippines, Benigno Aquino III. And she comes from, she's a former president of the Philippines. She was the successor of Marcos after the fall of his dictatorship. She was a U.S. puppet. I want to be very clear. She herself was a U.S. puppet. And she comes from the Cojuangco clan, which is probably one of the largest landlord families in the Philippines. They own a large tract of land that's actually bigger than Manila, called Hacienda Luisita. And in 2004, there was a massacre in Hacienda. It's a big sugar plantation. There was a big massacre in Hacienda Luisita when the workers decided to go on strike. And the Cojuangco and the Philippine military responded with bullets. And it was the first time that there was such a massive repressive response, military response to a union strike in the country. So that paved the way for a big wave of politically motivated killings and enforced disappearances in the country back in 2004 with the Hacienda Luisita massacre. So here so this is the main situation of Filipino women right now. So we had actually the Philippines can boast that they had 2 women presidents, 2 women in political power, 2 women fascists. You know, they basically oppressed working and peasant women in the country. So the fact that they were women has really nothing to do with their true character. Next slide. And bureaucrat capitalism. So without, imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism, there would be no imperialism without feudalism. There would be no feudalism without bureaucrat capitalism. So they're all interrelated. Imperialism's social base is feudalism. Feudalism is the social base of imperialism in this day and age. Without semi-feudal colonies outside where the imperialists are able to extract raw materials, there would be no fuel feeding the monster. Okay, that's why the struggles of semi-feudal, semi-colonial countries outside is so important to defeating imperialism. And the Philippines is an example of that. It's not the only example of that. It's one of the examples of that. So bureaucrat capitalism is basically, in a layman's terms, government corruption. It's basically government as big business, like its name indicates, and it is basically sustained by with fascism. So basically, the armed forces of the Philippines, or the AFP, is a continuance of the Philippine constabulary that was established by U.S. imperialism back during the Philippine-American War to serve the interests of U.S. imperialism, and right now the U.S. puppet reactionary state in the Philippines. So the AFP is basically a mercenary army. It's not a state security force at all. It's not an army of the people. That army is the New People's Army. They're an army of the people. And so, some famous female bureaucrat capitalists. Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who was a president of the Philippines, graduate of Georgetown, classmate of Bill Clinton. This is Corazon Aquino. She was famous. She became very famous because she came after Marcos. And then the one in the center is Amy Marcos. She's basically Marcos's daughter. She's also a politician in the Philippines. I believe she's a senator. And that's Gloria Macapagal with Barack Obama. And on top, that's a private army. A private army of that basically sustains, power for the bureaucrat, the fascists. So without fascism, there could be no bureaucrat capitalism. Okay, next slide. So and then there's also the particular gender oppression that Filipino women have to experience. The Philippines is over 300 years of Spanish colonial rule, and that means it's very much a deeply Catholic country. And Philippines, there's no such thing as legal divorce in the Philippines. If you're married, you're basically stuck with your partner, with your spouse, and you can't get a divorce legally in the Philippines. And there is such a thing as annulment, but annulment is very, very expensive. Only the rich can afford to get annulled. And because it's a deeply Catholic country, there's no such thing as birth control in the Philippines. There's no educational reproductive rights. Right now, there is a fight to legalize divorce and legalize to pass a reproductive health bill. And our sisters in Gabriela Women's Party List, which is the only all women's party list, political party in the Philippines, is waging that fight in the Philippine legislature right now for access to contraceptives, for education on how to on reproductive health, and also for the right to basically divorce your husband, especially if he's been abusive to you. So next. Oh, so sorry. So this here on the bottom, this is corporate Daniel Smith, who made headlines back in 2005 when he was basically arrested for charged with rape. He was the only one out of 5, or maybe 6, U.S. Personnel that was charged with a gang rape of a Filipina. That happens all the time. I don't want you to think that that's the reason why he's notable is because he was the only one that was prosecuted. It happens all the time, but they never get arrested. They're never tried in court. He was tried in court, and he was found guilty 1 out of 6. And so the continuing presence of U.S. troops in the Philippines poses a very big problem for Filipino women, because there's basically, for many years, especially when there were permanent bases in the Philippines, Filipino women were one option of employment for them is to basically be part of the rest and recreation programs for the U.S. soldiers, where truckloads, caravans of Filipino women would be carted off to the base in order to service the U.S. military personnel. It's actually quite disgusting, but very common. And these soldiers, even though there are no permanent bases in the Philippines now, they're still around. They're virtually permanent, and they're still raping Filipino women, quite disgustingly, and they're not. They enjoy impunity under Philippine law because they're foreign, and the Philippine government lets them go free. So they let him go free too, by the way. They detained him in a Philippine detention facility, and then they transferred him to a U.S. embassy, and then they flew him off here to the U.S. and no one knows where he is. Next. So I was talking earlier about the Philippine National Democratic Revolution. The revolutionary aspect of the National Democratic Movement is underground, led by the CPP, NPA, NDF. And here on the top is a picture of Lorena Barros. She's been dead for some time now. She was killed in an encounter.